welcome back to A Clock in the Journal. Tonight the shadows grow longer, and the whispers of war echo through the streets of Paris. In a world torn by conflict, a symbol emerges, the Golden Triangle, holding the secrets of power, fortune, and death. And only one man, master of disguise and thief of legend, dares to follow its trail. This is not just a chase for treasure, it's a race against destiny. Chapter 6. 19 minutes past 7. Patrice, in his bedroom at the home, was unable to sleep that night. He had a continual waking sensation of being oppressed and hunted down, as though he were suffering the terrors of some monstrous nightmare. He had an impression that the frantic series of events in which he was playing the combined parts of a bewildered spectator and a helpless actor would never cease so long as he tried to rest. That, on the contrary, they would rage with greater violence and intensity. The leave-taking of the husband and wife did not put an end, even momentarily, to the dangers incurred by Coralie. Fresh perils arose on every side, and Patrice Belval confessed himself incapable of foreseeing, and still more of allaying them. After lying awake for 2 hours, he switched on his electric light and began hurriedly to write down the story of the past 12 hours. He hoped in this way to some small extent to unravel the tangled knot. At 6 o'clock he went and roused Yabon and brought him back with him. Then, standing in front of the astonished Negro, he crossed his arms and exclaimed, "So you consider that your job is over? While I lie tossing about in the dark, my lord sleeps and all's well. My dear man, you have a jolly elastic conscience." The word elastic amused the Senegalese mightily. His mouth opened wider than ever, and he gave a grunt of enjoyment. That'll do," said the captain. "There's no getting a word in, once you start talking. Here, take a chair, read this report, and give me your reasoned opinion." "What? You don't know how to read? Well, upon my word, what was the good, then, of wearing out the seat of your trousers on the benches of the Senegal schools and colleges? A queer education, I must say." He heaved a sigh, and snatching the manuscript said, "Listen, reflect, argue, deduct, and conclude. This is how the matter briefly stands. First, we have one Essarès Bey, a banker, rich as Croesus, and the lowest of rapscallions, who betrays at one and the same time France, Egypt, England, Turkey, Bulgaria, and Greece, as is proved by the fact that his accomplices roast his feet for him. Thereupon he kills one of them, and gets rid of 4, with the aid of as many millions, which millions he orders another accomplice to get back for him before 5 minutes are past. And all these bright spirits will duck underground at 11 o'clock this morning, for at 12 o'clock the police propose to enter on the scene. Good." Patrice Belval paused to take breath and continued, "Secondly, little mother Coralie, upon my word, I can't say why, is married to Rapscallion Bey. She hates him and wants to kill him. He loves her and wants to kill her. There is also a colonel who loves her and for that reason loses his life, and a certain Mustafa who tries to kidnap her on the colonel's account and also loses his life for that reason, strangled by a Senegalese. Lastly, there is a French captain, a dot-and-carry one, who likewise loves her, but whom she avoids because she is married to a man whom she abhors. And with this captain, in a previous incarnation, she has halved an amethyst bead. Add to all this, by way of accessories, a rusty key, a red silk bowstring, a dog choked to death, and a grate filled with red coals. And if you dare to understand a single word of my explanation, I'll catch you a whack with my wooden leg, for I don't understand it a little bit, and I'm your captain." Yabon laughed all over his mouth, and all over the gaping scar that cut one of his cheeks in 2. As ordered by his captain, he understood nothing of the business, and very little of what Patrice had said. But he always quivered with delight when Patrice addressed him in that gruff tone. "That's enough," said the captain. "It's my turn now to argue, deduct, and conclude." He leant against the mantelpiece with his 2 elbows on the marble shelf and his head tight pressed between his hands. His merriment, which sprang from temperamental lightness of heart, was this time only a surface merriment. Deep down within himself he did nothing but think of Coralie with sorrowful apprehension. What could he do to protect her? A number of plans occurred to him. Which was he to choose? Should he hunt through the numbers in the telephone book till he hit upon the whereabouts of that Grégoire with whom Bourneuf and his companions had taken refuge? Should he inform the police? Should he return to the Rue Raynouard? He did not know. Yes, he was capable of acting, if the act to be performed consisted in flinging himself into the conflict with furious ardor. But to prepare the action, to divine the obstacles, to rend the darkness and, as he said, to see the invisible and grasp the intangible, that was beyond his powers. He turned suddenly to Yabon, who was standing depressed by his silence. "What's the matter with you, putting on that lugubrious air? Of course it's you that throw a gloom over me. You always look at the black side of things like a nigger. Be off." Yabon was going away discomfited, when someone tapped at the door and a voice said, "Captain Belval, you're wanted on the telephone." Patrice hurried out. Who on earth could be telephoning to him so early in the morning? "Who is it?" he asked the nurse. "I don't know, Captain. It's a man's voice. He seemed to want you urgently." The bell had been ringing some time. I was downstairs, in the kitchen. Before Patrice's eyes there rose a vision of the telephone in the Rue Raynouard, in the big room at the Essarès house. He could not help wondering if there was anything to connect the two incidents. He went down one flight of stairs and along a passage. The telephone was through a small waiting room, in a room that had been turned into a linen closet. He closed the door behind him. "Hello! Captain Belval speaking. What is it?" A voice, a man's voice which he did not know, replied in breathless, panting tones. "Ah, Captain Belval, it's you. Look here. But I'm almost afraid that it's too late. I don't know if I shall have time to finish. Did you get the key and the letter?" "Who are you?" asked Patrice. "Did you get the key and the letter?" the voice insisted. "The key? Yes," Patrice replied. "But not the letter." "Not the letter? But this is terrible. Then you don't know." A hoarse cry struck Patrice's ear, and the next thing he caught was incoherent sounds at the other end of the wire, the noise of an altercation. Then the voice seemed to glue itself to the instrument, and he distinctly heard it gasping. "Too late! Patrice! Is that you? Listen, the amethyst pendant—" "Yes, I have it on me. The pendant. Ah, it's too late. I should so much have liked to—" "Patrice, Coralie." Then again a loud cry, a heart-rending cry, and confused sounds growing more distant, in which he seemed to distinguish, "Help! Help!" These grew fainter and fainter. Silence followed. And suddenly there was a little click. The murderer had hung up the receiver. All this had not taken 20 seconds. But, when Patrice wanted to replace the telephone, his fingers were gripping it so hard that it needed an effort to relax them. He stood utterly dumbfounded. His eyes had fastened on a large clock, which he saw, through the window, on one of the buildings in the yard, marking 19 minutes past 7, and he mechanically repeated these figures, attributing a documentary value to them. Then he asked himself, so unreal did the scene appear to him, if all this was true, and if the crime had not been penetrated within himself, in the depths of his aching heart. But the shouting still echoed in his ears, and suddenly he took up the receiver again, like one clinging desperately to some undefined hope. "Hello!" he cried. "Exchange!" "Who was it rang me up just now? Are you there? Did you hear the cries? Are you there? Are you there?" There was no reply. He lost his temper, insulted the exchange, left the linen closet, met Yabon, and pushed him about. "Get out of this! It's your fault!" Of course you ought to have stayed and looked after Coralie. Be off there now and hold yourself at my disposal. I'm going to inform the police. If you hadn't prevented me, it would have been done long ago and we shouldn't be in this predicament. Off you go." He held him back. "No, don't stir. Your plan's ridiculous. Stay here." "Oh, not here in my pocket. You're too impetuous for me, my lad." He drove him out and returned to the linen closet, striding up and down and betraying his excitement in irritable gestures and angry words. Nevertheless, in the midst of his confusion, one idea gradually came to light, which was that, after all, he had no proof that the crime which he suspected had happened at the house in the Rue Renoir. He must not allow himself to be obsessed by the facts that lingered in his memory, to the point of always seeing the same vision in the same tragic setting. No doubt the drama was being continued, as he had felt that it would be, but perhaps elsewhere and far away from Coralie. And this first thought led to another. Why not investigate matters at once? Yes, why not? He asked himself. Before bothering the police, discovering the number of the person who rang me up and thus working back to the start, a process which it will be time enough to employ later, why shouldn't I telephone to the Rue Renoir at once, on any pretext and in anybody's name? I shall then have a chance of knowing what to think. Patrice felt that this measure did not amount to much. Suppose that no one answered. Would that prove that the murder had been committed in the house, or merely that no one was yet about? Nevertheless, the need to do something decided him. He looked up Essarès Bey's number in the telephone directory and resolutely rang up the exchange. The strain of waiting was almost more than he could bear, and then he was conscious of a thrill which vibrated through him from head to foot. He was connected, and someone at the other end was answering the call. "Hello," he said. "Hello," said a voice. "Who are you?" It was the voice of Essarès Bey. Although this was only natural, since at that moment Essarès must be getting his papers ready and preparing his flight, Patrice was so much taken aback that he did not know what to say, and spoke the first words that came into his head. "Is that Essarès Bey?" "Yes." "Who are you?" "I'm one of the wounded at the hospital, now under treatment at the home. Captain Belval, perhaps." Patrice was absolutely amazed. So Coralie's husband knew him by name? He stammered, "Yes, Captain Belval." "What a lucky thing," cried Essarès Bey in a tone of delight. "I rang you up a moment ago at the home, Captain Belval, to ask—" "Oh, it was you," interrupted Patrice, whose astonishment knew no bounds. "Yes, I wanted to know at what time I could speak to Captain Belval in order to thank him." "It was you! It was you!" Patrice repeated, more and more thunderstruck. Essarès' intonation denoted a certain surprise. "Yes, wasn't it a curious coincidence?" he said. "Unfortunately, I was cut off. Or rather, my call was interrupted by somebody else." "Then you heard?" "What, Captain Belval?" "Cries." "Cries? At least, so it seemed to me, but the connection was very indistinct. All that I heard was somebody asking for you, somebody who was in a great hurry. And, as I was not, I hung up the telephone and postponed the pleasure of thanking you." "Of thanking me?" "Yes, I have heard how my wife was assaulted last night and how you came to her rescue, and I am anxious to see you and express my gratitude. Shall we make an appointment? Could we meet at the hospital, for instance, at 3 o'clock this afternoon?" Patrice made no reply. The audacity of this man, threatened with arrest and preparing for flight, baffled him. At the same time, he was wondering what Essarès' real object had been in telephoning to him without being in any way obliged to. But Belval's silence in no way troubled the banker, who continued his civilities and ended the inscrutable conversation with a monologue in which he replied with the greatest ease to questions which he kept putting to himself. In spite of everything, Patrice felt more comfortable. He went back to his room, lay down on his bed, and slept for 2 hours. Then he sent for Yabon. "This time," he said, "try to control your nerves and not to lose your head as you did just now. You were absurd. But don't let's talk about it. Have you had your breakfast? No? No more have I. Have you seen the doctor? No? No more have I. and the surgeon has just promised to take off this beastly bandage. You can imagine how pleased I am. A wooden leg is all very well, but a head wrapped up in lint, for a lover, never. Get on, look sharp. When we're ready, we'll start for the hospital. Little Mother Coralie can't forbid me to see her there." Patrice was as happy as a schoolboy. As he said to Yabon an hour later, on their way to the Porte Maillot, the clouds were beginning to roll by. "Yes, Yabon, yes they are, and this is where we stand." To begin with, Coralie is not in danger. As I hoped, the battle is being fought far away from her, among the accomplices no doubt, over their millions. As for the unfortunate man who rang me up and whose dying cries I overheard, he was obviously some unknown friend, for he addressed me familiarly and called me by my Christian name. It was certainly he who sent me the key of the garden. Unfortunately, the letter that came with the key went astray. In the end, he felt constrained to tell me everything. Just at that moment he was attacked. By whom, you ask? Probably by one of the accomplices, who was frightened of his revelations. There you are, Yabon. It's all as clear as noonday. For that matter, the truth may just as easily be the exact opposite of what I suggest. But I don't care. The great thing is to take one's stand upon a theory, true or false. Besides, if mine is false, I reserve the right to shift the responsibility on you. So you know what you're in for. At the Porte Maillot they took a cab, and it occurred to Patrice to drive round by the Rue Rainoir. At the junction of this street with the Rue de Passy, they saw Coralie leaving the Rue Rainoir, accompanied by old Simeon. She had hailed a taxi and stepped inside. Simeon sat down by the driver. They went to the hospital in the Champs-Élysées, with Patrice following. It was 11 o'clock when they arrived. "All's well," said Patrice. While her husband is running away, she refuses to make any change in her daily life. He and Yabon lunched in the neighborhood, strolled along the avenue without losing sight of the hospital, and called there at 1:30. Patrice at once saw old Simeon, sitting at the end of a covered yard where the soldiers used to meet. His head was half wrapped up in the usual comforter, and with his big yellow spectacles on his nose, he sat smoking his pipe on the chair which he always occupied. As for Coralie, she was in one of the rooms allotted to her on the first floor, seated by the bedside of a patient whose hand she held between her own. The man was asleep. Coralie appeared to Patrice to be very tired. The dark rings round her eyes and the unusual pallor of her cheeks bore witness to her fatigue. Poor child, he thought. All those blackguards will be the death of you. He now understood, when he remembered the scenes of the night before, why Coralie kept her private life secret and endeavored, at least to the little world of the hospital, to be merely the kind sister whom people call by her Christian name. Suspecting the web of crime with which she was surrounded, she dropped her husband's name and told nobody where she lived. And so well was she protected by the defenses set up by her modesty and determination that Patrice dared not go to her and stood rooted to the threshold. Yet surely, he said to himself as he looked at Coralie without being seen by her, I'm not going to send her in my card. He was making up his mind to enter, when a woman who had come up the stairs, talking loudly as she went, called out, "Where is Madame?" "Monsieur Simeon, she must come at once." Old Simeon, who had climbed the stairs with her, pointed to where Coralie sat at the far end of the room, and the woman rushed in. She said a few words to Coralie, who seemed upset, and at once ran to the door, passing in front of Patrice, and down the stairs, followed by Simeon and the woman. "I've got a taxi, ma'am," stammered the woman, all out of breath. "I had the luck to find one when I left the house, and I kept it. We must be quick, ma'am. The commissary of police told me to—" Patrice, who was downstairs by this time, heard nothing more, but the last words decided him. He seized hold of Yabon as he passed, and the two of them leapt into a cab, telling the driver to follow Coralie's taxi. "There's news, Yabon, there's news," said Patrice. "The plot is thickening. The woman is obviously one of the Essarès servants, and she has come for her mistress by the commissary's orders. Therefore, the Colonel's disclosures are having their effect. House searched, magistrate's inquest, every sort of worry for little Mother Coralie, and you have the cheek to advise me to be careful. You imagine that I would leave her to her own devices at such a moment. What a mean nature you must have, my poor Yabon." An idea occurred to him, and he exclaimed, "Heavens! I hope that ruffian of an Essarès hasn't allowed himself to be caught. That would be a disaster, but he was far too sure of himself. I expect he's been trifling away his time." All through the drive this fear excited Captain Belval and removed his last scruples. In the end, his certainty was absolute. Nothing short of Essarès' arrest could have produced the servant's attitude of panic or Coralie's precipitate departure. Under these conditions, how could he hesitate to interfere in a matter in which his revelations would enlighten the police? All the more so as, by revealing less or more, according to circumstances, he could make his evidence subservient to Coralie's interests. The two cabs pulled up almost simultaneously outside the Essarès house, where a car was already standing. Coralie alighted and disappeared through the carriage gate. The maid and Simeon also crossed the pavement. "Come along," said Patrice to the Senegalese. The front door was ajar, and Patrice entered. In the big hall were two policemen on duty. Patrice acknowledged their presence with a hurried movement of his hand, and passed them with the air of a man who belonged to the house, and whose importance was so great that nothing done without him could be of any use. The sound of his footsteps echoing on the flags reminded him of the flight of Barnef and his accomplices. He was on the right road. Moreover, there was a drawing-room on the left, the room communicating with the library to which the accomplices had carried the Colonel's body. Voices came from the library. He walked across the drawing-room. At that moment he heard Coralie exclaim in accents of terror, "Oh, my God, it can't be!" Two other policemen barred the doorway. "I am a relation of Madame Essarès," he said, "her only relation. We have our orders, Captain." "I know, of course. Be sure and let no one in. Yabon, stay here." And he went in. But in the immense room, a group of 6 or 7 gentlemen, no doubt commissaries of police and magistrates, stood in his way, bending over something which he was unable to distinguish. From amidst this group Coralie suddenly appeared and came towards him, tottering and wringing her hands. The housemaid took her round the waist and pressed her into a chair. "What's the matter?" asked Patrice. "Madame is feeling faint," replied the woman, still quite distraught. "Oh, I'm nearly off my head." "But why? What's the reason?" "It's the master. Just think. Such a sight. It gave me a turn, too." "What sight?" One of the gentlemen left the group and approached. "Is Madame Essarès ill?" "It's nothing," said the maid. "A fainting fit. She is liable to these attacks. Take her away as soon as she can walk. We shall not need her any longer." And addressing Patrice Belval with a questioning air, "Captain?" Patrice pretended not to understand. "Yes, sir," he said. "We will take Madame Essarès away. Her presence, as you say, is unnecessary. Only I must first." He moved aside to avoid his interlocutor, and, perceiving that the group of magistrates had opened out a little, stepped forward. What he now saw explained Coralie's fainting fit and the servant's agitation. He himself felt his flesh creep at a spectacle which was infinitely more horrible than that of the evening before. On the floor, near the fireplace, almost at the place where he had undergone his torture, Essarès Bey lay upon his back. He was wearing the same clothes as on the previous day, a brown velvet smoking suit with a braided jacket. His head and shoulders had been covered with a napkin. But one of the men standing around, a divisional surgeon no doubt, was holding up the napkin with one hand and pointing to the dead man's face with the other, while he offered an explanation in a low voice. And that face! But it was hardly the word for the unspeakable mass of flesh, part of which seemed to be charred, while the other part formed no more than a blood-stained pulp, mixed with bits of bone and skin, hairs, and a broken eyeball. "Oh," Patrice blurted out, "how horrible! He was killed and fell with his head right in the fire." "That's how they found him, I suppose?" The man who had already spoken to him and who appeared to be the most important figure present came up to him once more. "May I ask who you are?" he demanded. "Captain Belval, sir, a friend of Madame Essarès, one of the wounded officers whose lives she has helped to save." "That may be, sir," replied the important figure, "but you can't stay here. Nobody must stay here for that matter. Monsieur le Commissaire, please order everyone to leave the room except the doctor and have the door guarded. Let no one enter on any pretext whatever." "Sir," Patrice insisted, "I have some very serious information to communicate. I shall be pleased to receive it, Captain, but later on. You must excuse me now." Chapter 7, 23 minutes past 12. The great hall that ran from Rue Raynouard to the upper terrace of the garden was filled to half its extent by a wide staircase, and divided the Essarès house into two parts, communicating only by way of the hall. On the left were the drawing-room and the library, which was followed by an independent block containing a private staircase. On the right were a billiard-room and the dining-room, both with lower ceilings. Above these were Essarès Bey's bedroom, on the street side, and Coralie's, overlooking the garden. Beyond was the servants' wing, where old Simeon also used to sleep. Patrice was asked to wait in the billiard-room with the Senegalese. He had been there about a quarter of an hour when Simeon and the maid were shown in. The old secretary seemed quite paralyzed by the death of his employer and was holding forth under his breath, making queer gestures as he spoke. Patrice asked him how things were going, and the old fellow whispered in his ear, "It's not over yet. There's something to fear today, presently." "Presently?" asked Patrice. Yes, said the old man, trembling. He said nothing more. As for the housemaid, she readily told her story in reply to Patrice's questions. "The first surprise, sir, this morning was that there was no butler, no footman, no porter. All the three were gone. Then, at 6:30, Monsieur Simeon came and told us from the master that the master had locked himself in his library and that he wasn't to be disturbed even for breakfast. The mistress was not very well. She had her chocolate at 9 o'clock. At 10 o'clock she went out with Monsieur Simeon. Then, after we had done the bedrooms, we never left the kitchen. 11 o'clock came, 12, and just as the hour was striking, we heard a loud ring at the front door. I looked out of the window. There was a motor, with 4 gentlemen inside. I went to the door. The commissary of police explained who he was and wanted to see the master. I showed them the way. The library door was locked. We knocked. No answer. We shook it. No answer. In the end, one of the gentlemen who knew how picked the lock. Then, you can imagine what we saw. But you can't. It was much worse. Because the poor master at that moment had his head almost under the grate. Oh, what scoundrels they must have been. For they did kill him, didn't they? I know one of the gentlemen said at once that the master had died of a stroke and fallen into the fire. Only my firm belief is... Old Simeon had listened without speaking, with his head still half wrapped up, showing only his bristly gray beard and his eyes hidden behind their yellow spectacles. But at this point of the story he gave a little chuckle, came up to Patrice and said in his ear, "There's something to fear. To fear. Madame Coralie, make her go away at once. Make her go away. If not, it'll be the worse for her." Patrice shuddered and tried to question him, but could learn nothing more. Besides, the old man did not remain. A policeman came to fetch him and took him to the library. His evidence lasted a long time. It was followed by the depositions of the cook and the housemaid. Next, Coralie's evidence was taken, in her own room. At 4 o'clock another car arrived. Patrice saw 2 gentlemen pass into the hall, with everybody bowing very low before them. He recognized the Minister of Justice and the Minister of the Interior. They conferred in the library for half an hour and went away again. At last, shortly before 5 o'clock, a policeman came for Patrice and showed him up to the first floor. The man tapped at a door and stood aside. Patrice entered a small boudoir, lit up by a wood fire by which 2 persons were seated. Coralie, to whom he bowed, and opposite her, the gentleman who had spoken to him on his arrival and who seemed to be directing the whole inquiry. He was a man of about 50, with a thick-set body and a heavy face, slow of movement, but with bright, intelligent eyes. "The examining magistrate, I presume, sir?" asked Patrice. "No," he replied. "I am M. Masseron, a retired magistrate, specially appointed to clear up this affair, not to examine it as you think, for it does not seem to me that there is anything to examine." "What?" cried Patrice in great surprise. "Nothing to examine?" He looked at Coralie, who kept her eyes fixed upon him attentively. Then she turned them on Monsieur Masseron, who resumed. "I have no doubt, Captain Belval, that when we have said what we have to say, we shall be agreed at all points, just as Madame and I are already agreed." "I don't doubt it either," said Patrice. "All the same, I am afraid that many of those points remain unexplained." "Certainly. But we shall find an explanation. We shall find it together. Will you please tell me what you know?" Patrice waited for a moment, and then said, "I will not disguise my astonishment, sir. The story which I have to tell is of some importance, and yet there is no one here to take it down. Is it not to count as evidence given on oath, as a deposition which I shall have to sign? You yourself, Captain, shall determine the value of your words and the innuendo which you wish them to bear. For the moment, we will look on this as a preliminary conversation, as an exchange of views relating to facts, touching which Madame Essarès has given me, I believe, the same information that you will be able to give me." Patrice did not reply at once. He had a vague impression that there was a private understanding between Coralie and the magistrate, and that, in face of that understanding, he, both by his presence and by his zeal, was playing the part of an intruder whom they would gladly have dismissed. He resolved, therefore, to maintain an attitude of reserve until the magistrate had shown his hand. "Of course," he said. "I dare say Madame has told you. So you know of the conversation which I overheard yesterday at the restaurant?" "Yes." "And the attempt to kidnap Madame Essarès?" "Yes." "And the murder?" "Yes." "Madame Essarès described to you the blackmailing scene that took place last night, with Monsieur Essarès for a victim, the details of the torture, the death of the colonel, the handing over of the 4 millions, the conversation on the telephone between Monsieur Essarès and a certain Grégoire, and lastly, the threats uttered against Madame by her husband?" "Yes, Captain Belval, I know all this, that is to say, all that you know, and I know, in addition, all that I discovered through my own investigations." Of course," Patrice repeated. "I see that my story becomes superfluous, and that you are in possession of all the necessary factors to enable you to draw your conclusions." And, continuing to put rather than answer questions, he added, "May I ask what inference you have arrived at?" "To tell you the truth, Captain, my inferences are not definite. However, until I receive some proof to the contrary, I propose to remain satisfied with the actual words of a letter which Essarès wrote to his wife at about 12 o'clock this morning, and which we found lying on his desk unfinished. Madame Essarès asked me to read it, and, if necessary, to communicate the contents to you. Listen." Monsieur Masseron proceeded to read the letter aloud. "Coralie, you were wrong yesterday to attribute my departure to reasons which I dared not acknowledge, and perhaps I also was wrong not to defend myself more convincingly against your accusation. The only motive for my departure is the hatred with which I am surrounded. You have seen how fierce it is, in the face of these enemies who are seeking to despoil me by every possible means. My only hope of salvation lies in flight. That is why I am going away. But let me remind you, Coralie, of my clearly expressed wish. You are to join me at the first summons. If you do not leave Paris, then, Nothing shall protect you against my lawful resentment. Nothing, not even my death. I have made all my arrangements so that, even in the contingency—" "The letter ends there," said Monsieur Mazarin, handing it back to Coralie, "and we know by an unimpeachable sign that the last lines were written immediately before Monsieur Essarès' death, because in falling he upset a little clock which stood on his desk, and which marked 23 minutes past 12. I assume that he felt unwell, and that, on trying to rise, he was seized with a fit of giddiness and fell to the floor. Unfortunately, the fireplace was near, with a fierce fire blazing in it. His head struck the grate, and the wound that resulted was so deep, the surgeon testified to this, that he fainted. Then the fire close at hand did its work, with the effects which you have seen." Patrice had listened in amazement to this unexpected explanation. "Then, in your opinion," he asked, "Monsieur Essarès died of an accident? He was not murdered?" "Murdered? Certainly not. We have no clue to support any such theory." "Still, Captain Belval, you are the victim of an association of ideas which, I admit, is perfectly justifiable. Ever since yesterday, you have been witnessing a series of tragic incidents, and your imagination naturally leads you to the most tragic solution, that of murder. Only, reflect, why should a murder have been committed? And by whom? By Bourneuf and his friends? With what object? They were crammed full with banknotes, and, even admitting that the man called Grégoire recovered those millions from them, they would certainly not have got them back by killing Monsieur Essarès. Then again, how would they have entered the house? And how can they have gone out? No, Captain, you must excuse me, but Monsieur Essarès died an accidental death. The facts are undeniable, and this is the opinion of the divisional surgeon, who will draw up his report in that sense." Patrice turned to Coralie. "Is it Madame Essarès' opinion also?" She reddened slightly and answered, "Yes." "And old Simeon's?" "Oh," replied the magistrate, "old Simeon is wandering in his mind. To listen to him, you would think that everything was about to happen all over again, that Madame Essarès is threatened with danger, and that she ought to take to flight at once. That is all that I have been able to get out of him. However, he took me to an old, disused door that opens out of the garden on a lane running at right angles with the Rue Rainoir, and here he showed me first the watchdog's dead body, and next some footprints between the door and the flight of steps near the library. But you know those footprints, do you not? They belong to you and your Senegalese. As for the death of the watchdog, I can put that down to your Senegalese, can't I?" Patrice was beginning to understand. The magistrate's reticence, his explanation, his agreement with Coralie, all this was gradually becoming plain. He put the question frankly, "So there was no murder?" "No." "Then there will be no magistrate's examination?" "No." "And no talk about the matter? It will all be kept quiet, in short, and forgotten?" "Just so." Captain Belval began to walk up and down, as was his habit. He now remembered Essarès' prophecy. "I shan't to be arrested. If I am, I shall be let go. The matter will be hushed up." Essarès was right. The hand of justice was arrested, and there was no way for Coralie to escape silent complicity. Patrice was intensely annoyed by the manner in which the case was being handled. It was certain that a compact had been concluded between Coralie and Monsieur Mazarin. He suspected the magistrate of circumventing Coralie and inducing her to sacrifice her own interests to other considerations. To effect this, the first thing was to get rid of him, Patrice. "Ugh," said Patrice to himself, "I'm fairly sick of this sportsman, with his cool, ironical ways. It looks as if he were doing a considerable piece of thimble-rigging at my expense." He restrained himself, however, and with a pretense of wanting to keep on good terms with the magistrate, came and sat down beside him. "You must forgive me, sir," he said, "for insisting in what may appear to you an indiscreet fashion. But my conduct is explained not only by such sympathy or feeling as I entertain for Madame Essarès at a moment in her life when she is more lonely than ever, a sympathy and feeling which she seems to repulse even more firmly than she did before. It is also explained by certain mysterious links which unite us to each other, and which go back to a period too remote for our eyes to focus. Has Madame Essarès told you those details? In my opinion, they are most important, and I cannot help associating them with the events that interest us. Monsieur Mazarin glanced at Coralie, who nodded. He answered, "Yes, Madame. Essarès has informed me, and even—" He hesitated once more, and again consulted Coralie, who flushed and seemed put out of countenance. Mazarin, however, waited for a reply which would enable him to proceed. She ended by saying in a low voice, "Captain Belval is entitled to know what we have discovered. The truth belongs as much to him as to me, and I have no right to keep it from him. Pray speak, monsieur." "I doubt if it is even necessary to speak," said the magistrate. "It will be enough, I think, to show the captain this photograph album which I have found. Here you are, Captain Belval." And he handed Patrice a very slender album, covered in gray canvas and fastened with an India rubber band. Patrice took it with a certain anxiety, but what he saw on opening it was so utterly unexpected that he gave an exclamation. "It's incredible!" On the first page, held in place by their four corners, were two photographs. One, on the right, representing a small boy in an Eton jacket. The other, on the left, representing a very little girl. There was an inscription under each. On the right, Patrice at 10. On the left, Coralie at 3. Moved beyond expression, Patrice turned the leaf. On the second page they appeared again. He at the age of 15, she at the age of 8. And he saw himself at 19 and at 23 and at 28, always accompanied by Coralie, first as a little girl, then as a young girl, next as a woman. "This is incredible," he cried. "How is it possible? Here are portraits of myself which I had never seen, amateur photographs obviously, which trace my whole life. Here's one when I was doing my military training. Here I am on horseback. Who can have ordered these photographs, and who can have collected them together with yours, madame?" He fixed his eyes on Coralie, who evaded their questioning gaze and lowered her head as though the close connection between their two lives, to which those pages bore witness, had shaken her to the very depths of her being. "Who can have brought them together?" he repeated. "Do you know? And where does the album come from?" Monsieur Mazarin supplied the answer. It was the surgeon who found it. Essarès wore a vest under his shirt, and the album was in an inner pocket, a pocket sewn inside the vest. The surgeon felt the boards through it when he was undressing Essarès' body. This time, Patrice's and Coralie's eyes met. The thought that Essarès had been collecting both their photographs during the past 20 years, and that he wore them next to his breast, and that he had lived and died with them upon him, this thought amazed them so much that they did not even try to fathom its strange significance. "Are you sure of what you are saying, sir?" asked Patrice. "I was there," said Monsieur Mazarin. "I was present at the discovery. Besides, I myself made another which confirms this one, and completes it in a really surprising fashion. I found a pendant, cut out of a solid block of amethyst, and held in a setting of filigree work." "What's that?" cried Captain Belval. "What's that? A pendant? An amethyst pendant?" "Look for yourself, sir," suggested the magistrate, after once more consulting Madame Essarès with a glance. And he handed Captain Belval an amethyst pendant, larger than the ball formed by joining the two halves which Coralie and Patrice possessed, she on her rosary and he on his bunch of seals. And this new ball was encircled with a specimen of gold filigree work exactly like that on the rosary and on the seal. The setting served as a clasp. "Am I to open it?" he asked. Coralie nodded. He opened the pendant. The inside was divided by a movable glass disc, which separated two miniature photographs, one of Coralie as a nurse, the other of himself wounded, in an officer's uniform. Patrice reflected, with pale cheeks. Presently he asked, "And where does this pendant come from? Did you find it, sir?" Yes, Captain Belval. Where? The magistrate seemed to hesitate. Coralie's attitude gave Patrice the impression that she was unaware of this detail. Monsieur Masseron at last said, I found it in the dead man's hand. In the dead man's hand? In Monsieur. Essarès' hand? Patrice had given a start, as though under an unexpected blow, and was now leaning over the magistrate, greedily awaiting a reply which he wanted to hear for the second time before accepting it as certain. Yes, in his hand. I had to force back the clasped fingers in order to release it. Belval stood up and, striking the table with his fist, exclaimed, Well, sir, I will tell you one thing which I was keeping back as a last argument to prove to you that my collaboration is of use, and this thing becomes of great importance after what we have just learnt. Sir, this morning someone asked to speak to me on the telephone, and I had hardly answered the call when this person, who seemed greatly excited, was the victim of a murderous assault committed in my hearing. And amid the sound of the scuffle and the cries of agony, I caught the following words, which the unhappy man insisted on trying to get to me as so many last instructions. Patrice. Coralie, the amethyst pendant. Yes, I have it on me. The pendant. It's too late. I should so much have liked... Patrice, Coralie. There's what I heard, sir, and here are the two facts which we cannot escape. This morning, at 7:19, a man was murdered, having upon him an amethyst pendant. This is the first undeniable fact. A few hours later, at 12:23, this same amethyst pendant is discovered clutched in the hand of another man. This is the second undeniable fact. Place these facts side by side, and you are bound to come to the conclusion that the first murder, the one of which I caught the distant echo, was committed here, in this house, in the same library which, since yesterday evening, witnessed the end of every scene in the tragedy which we are contemplating. This revelation, which in reality amounted to a fresh accusation against Essarès, seemed to affect the magistrate profoundly. Patrice had flung himself into the discussion with a passionate vehemence and a logical reasoning which it was impossible to disregard without evident insincerity. Coralie had turned aside slightly, and Patrice could not see her face, but he suspected her dismay in the presence of all this infamy and shame. Monsieur Masseron raised an objection. Two undeniable facts, you say, Captain Belval? As to the first point, let me remark that we have not found the body of the man who is supposed to have been murdered at 7:19 this morning. It will be found in due course. Very well. Second point, as regards the amethyst pendant discovered in Essarès' hand, how can we tell that Essarès Bey found it in the murdered man's hand and not somewhere else? For, after all, we do not know if he was at home at that time, and still less if he was in his library. But I do know. How? I telephoned to him a few minutes later, and he answered. More than that, to sweep away any trace of doubt, he told me that he had rung me up, but that he had been cut off. M. Masseron thought for a moment and then said, Did he go out this morning? Ask Madame Essarès. Without turning round, manifestly wishing to avoid Belval's eyes, Coralie answered, I don't think that he went out. The suit he was wearing at the time of his death was an indoor suit. Did you see him after last night? He came and knocked at my room 3 times this morning, between 7 and 9 o'clock. I did not open the door. At about 11 o'clock I started off alone. I heard him call old Simeon and tell him to go with me. Simeon caught me up in the street. That is all I know. A prolonged silence ensued. Each of the 3 was meditating upon this strange series of adventures. In the end, Monsieur Masseron, who had realized that a man of Captain Belval's stamp was not the sort to be easily thrust aside, spoke in the tone of one who, before coming to terms, wishes to know exactly what his adversary's last word is likely to be. Let us come to the point, Captain. You are building up a theory which strikes me as very vague. What is it, precisely? And what are you proposing to do if I decline to accept it? I have asked you two very plain questions. Do you mind answering them?" "I will answer them, sir, as plainly as you put them." He went up to the magistrate and said, "Here, sir, is the field of battle and of attack. Yes, of attack, if need be, which I select. Man who used to know me, who knew Madame Essarès as a child, and who was interested in both of us, a man who used to collect our portraits at different ages, who had reasons for loving us unknown to me, who sent me the key of that garden, and who was making arrangements to bring us together for a purpose which he would have told us, this man was murdered at the moment when he was about to execute his plan. Now everything tells me that he was murdered by M. Essarès. I am therefore resolved to lodge an information, whatever the results of my action may be, and believe me, sir, my charge will not be hushed up. There are always means of making oneself heard, even if I am reduced to shouting the truth from the housetops." M. Masseron burst out laughing. "By Jove, Captain, but you're letting yourself go. I'm behaving according to my conscience, and Madame Essarès, I feel sure, will forgive me. She knows that I am acting for her good. She knows that all will be over with her if this case is hushed up, and if the authorities do not assist her. She knows that the enemies who threaten her are implacable. They will stop at nothing to attain their object and to do away with her, for she stands in their way. And the terrible thing about it is that the most clear-seeing eyes are unable to make out what that object is. We are playing the most formidable game against these enemies, and we do not even know what the stakes are. Only the police can discover those stakes." M. Masseron waited for a second or two, and then, laying his hand on Patrice's shoulder, said calmly, "And suppose the authorities knew what the stakes were?" Patrice looked at him in surprise. "What? Do you mean to say you know?" "Perhaps. And can you tell me?" "Oh, well, if you force me to." "What are they?" "Not much. A trifle." "But what sort of trifle?" 1,000 million francs. 1,000 millions? Just that. 1,000 millions, of which 2/3, I regret to say, if not 3/4, had already left France before the war. But the remaining 250 or 300 millions are worth more than 1,000 millions all the same, for a very good reason. What reason? They happen to be in gold. Chapter 8. Essarès Bey's Work. This time Captain Belval seemed to relax to some extent. He vaguely perceived the consideration that compelled the authorities to wage the battle prudently. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Yes. I was instructed to investigate this matter 2 years ago, and my inquiries proved that really remarkable exports of gold were being effected from France. But, I confess, it is only since my conversation with Madame Essarès that I have seen where the leakage came from and who it was that set on foot, all over France, down to the least important market towns, the formidable organization through which the indispensable metal was made to leave the country. Then Madame Essarès knew? No, but she suspected a great deal, and last night, before you arrived, she overheard some words spoken between Essarès and his assailants, which she repeated to me, thus giving me the key to the riddle. I should have been glad to work out the complete solution without your assistance. For one thing, those were the orders of the Minister of the Interior, and Madame Essarès displayed the same wish, but your impetuosity overcomes my hesitation, and since I can't manage to get rid of you, Captain Belval, I will tell you the whole story frankly, especially as your cooperation is not to be despised." "I am all ears," said Patrice, who was burning to know more. "Well, the motive force of the plot was here, in this house. Essarès Bey, president of the Franco-Oriental Bank, 6, Rue Lafayette, apparently an Egyptian, in reality a Turk, enjoyed the greatest influence in the Paris financial world. He had been naturalized an Englishman, but had kept up secret relations with the former possessors of Egypt, and he had received instructions from a foreign power, which I'm not yet able to name with certainty, to bleed, there's no other word for it, to bleed France of all the gold that he could cause to flow into his coffers. According to documents which I have seen, he succeeded in exporting in this way some 700 million francs in 2 years. A last consignment was preparing when war was declared. You can understand that thenceforth such important sums could not be smuggled out of the country so easily as in times of peace. The railway wagons are inspected on the frontiers, the outgoing vessels are searched in the harbors. In short, the gold was not sent away. Those 250 or 300 millions remained in France. 10 months passed, and the inevitable happened, which was that Essarès Bey, having this fabulous treasure at his disposal, clung to it, came gradually to look upon it as his own, and in the end resolved to appropriate it. Only there were accomplices. The men I saw last night? Yes, 6 shady Levantines, sham naturalized French citizens, more or less well-disguised Bulgarians, secret agents of the little German courts in the Balkans. This gang ran provincial branches of Essarès Bank. It had in its pay, on Essarès' account, hundreds of minor agents, who scoured the villages, visited the fairs, were hail-fellow-well met with the peasants, offered them banknotes and government securities in exchange for French gold, and trousered all their savings. When war broke out, the gang shut up shop and gathered round Essarès Bey, who also had closed his offices in the Rue Lafayette. What happened then? Things that we don't know. No doubt the accomplices learnt from their governments that the last dispatch of gold had never taken place, and no doubt they also guessed that Essarès Bey was trying to keep for himself the 300 millions collected by the gang. One thing is certain, that a struggle began between the former partners, a fierce, implacable struggle, the accomplices wanting their share of the plunder, while Essarès Bey was resolved to part with none of it, and pretended that the millions had left the country. Yesterday the struggle attained its culminating point. In the afternoon the accomplices tried to get hold of Madame Essarès so that they might have a hostage to use against her husband. In the evening you yourself witnessed the final episode. But why yesterday evening rather than another? Because the accomplices had every reason to think that the millions were intended to disappear yesterday evening. Though they did not know the methods employed by Essarès Bey when he made his last remittances, they believed that each of the remittances, or rather each removal of the sacks, was preceded by a signal. Yes, a shower of sparks, was it not? Exactly. In a corner of the garden are some old conservatories, above which stands the furnace that used to heat them. This grimy furnace, full of soot and rubbish, sends forth, when you light it, flakes of fire and sparks which are seen at a distance and serve as an intimation. Essarès Bey lit it last night himself. The accomplices at once took alarm and came prepared to go any lengths. And Essarès' plan failed. Yes, but so did theirs. The colonel is dead. The others were only able to get hold of a few bundles of notes which have probably been taken from them by this time. But the struggle was not finished, and its dying agony has been a most shocking tragedy. According to your statement, a man who knew you and who was seeking to get into touch with you was killed at 19 minutes past 7, most likely by Essarès Bey, who dreaded his intervention. And 5 hours later, at 23 past 12, Essarès Bey himself was murdered, presumably by one of his accomplices. There is the whole story, Captain Belval. And, now that you know as much of it as I do, don't you think that the investigation of this case should remain secret and be pursued not quite in accordance with the ordinary rules? After a moment's reflection, Patrice said, "Yes, I agree." "There can be no doubt about it," cried M. Masseron. "Not only will it serve no purpose to publish this story of gold which has disappeared and which can't be found, which would startle the public and excite their imaginations, but you will readily imagine that an operation which consisted in draining off such a quantity of gold in 2 years cannot have been effected without compromising a regrettable number of people. I feel certain that my own inquiries will reveal a series of weak concessions and unworthy bargains on the part of certain more or less important banks and credit houses. transactions on which I do not wish to insist, but which it would be the gravest of blunders to publish. Therefore, silence. But is silence possible? Why not? Bless my soul, there are a good few corpses to be explained away. Colonel Fakki's, for instance. Suicide. Mustafa's, which you will discover or which you have already discovered in the Galliera garden. Found dead. Essarès Bey's, an accident, so that all these manifestations of the same power will remain separated? There is nothing to show the link that connects them. Perhaps the public will think otherwise. The public will think what we wish it to think. This is wartime. The press will speak. The press will do nothing of the kind. We have the censorship. But if some fact, or rather, a fresh crime, quote, why should there be a fresh crime? The matter is finished, at least on its active and dramatic side. The chief actors are dead. The curtain falls on the murder of Essarès Bey. As for the supernumeraries, Burneff and the others, we shall have them stowed away in an internment camp before a week is past. We therefore find ourselves in the presence of a certain number of millions, with no owner, with no one who dares to claim them, on which France is entitled to lay hands. I shall devote my activity to securing the money for the Republic. Patrice Belval shook his head. Madame Essarès remains, sir. We must not forget her husband's threats. He is dead. No matter, the threats are there. Old Simeon tells you so in a striking fashion. He is half mad. Exactly. His brain retains the impression of great and imminent danger. No, the struggle is not ended. Perhaps, indeed, it is only beginning. Well, Captain, are we not here? Make it your business to protect and defend Madame Essarès by all the means in your power, and by all those which I place at your disposal. Our collaboration will be uninterrupted, because my task lies here and because, if the battle, which you expect, and I do not, takes place, it will be within the walls of this house and garden. What makes you think that? Some words which Madame Essarès overheard last night. The colonel repeated several times. The gold is here, Essarès, he added. For years past your car brought to this house all that there was at your bank in the Rue Lafayette. Simeon, you and the chauffeur used to let the sacks down the last grating on the left. How you used to send it away, I do not know. But of what was here on the day when the war broke out, of the 17 or 1800 bags which they were expecting out yonder, none has left your place. I suspected the trick, and we kept watch night and day. The gold is here. And have you no clue? Not one, or this at most, but I attach comparatively little value to it. He took a crumpled paper from his pocket, unfolded it, and continued. Besides the pendant, Essarès Bey held in his hand this bit of blotted paper, on which you can see a few straggling, hurriedly written words. The only ones that are more or less legible are these: golden triangle. What this golden triangle means, what it has to do with the case in hand, I can't for the present tell. The most that I am able to presume is that, like the pendant, the scrap of paper was snatched by Essarès Bey from the man who died at 19 minutes past 7 this morning, and that, when he himself was killed at 23 minutes past 12, he was occupied in examining it. And then there is the album, said Patrice, making his last point. You see how all the details are linked together. You may safely believe that it is all one case. Very well, said Monsieur Masseron. One case in two parts. You, Captain, had better follow up the second. I grant you that nothing could be stranger than this discovery of photographs of Madame Essarès and yourself in the same album and in the same pendant. It sets a problem, the solution of which will no doubt bring us very near to the truth. We shall meet again soon, Captain Belval, I hope. And, once more, make use of me and of my men. He shook Patrice by the hand. Patrice held him back. I shall make use of you, sir, as you suggest, but is this not the time to take the necessary precautions? They are taken, Captain. We are in occupation of the house. Yes, I know. But all the same, I have a sort of presentiment that the day will not end without. Remember old Simeon's strange words." M. Masseron began to laugh. "Come, Captain Belval, we mustn't exaggerate things. If any enemies remain for us to fight, they must stand in great need, for the moment, of taking counsel with themselves. We'll talk about this tomorrow, shall we, Captain?" He shook hands with Patrice again, bowed to Madame Essarès, and left the room. Belval had at first made a discreet movement to go out with him. He stopped at the door and walked back again. Madame Essarès, who seemed not to hear him, sat motionless, bent in two, with her head turned away from him. "Coralie," he said. She did not reply, and he uttered her name a second time, hoping that again she might not answer, for her silence suddenly appeared to him to be the one thing in the world for him to desire. That silence no longer implied either constraint or rebellion. Coralie accepted the fact that he was there, by her side, as a helpful friend. And Patrice no longer thought of all the problems that harassed him, nor of the murders that had mounted up, one after another, around them, nor of the dangers that might still encompass them. He thought only of Coralie's yielding gentleness. "Don't answer, Coralie. Don't say a word. It is for me to speak. I must tell you what you do not know, the reasons that made you wish to keep me out of this house, and out of your very life." He put his hand on the back of the chair in which she was sitting, and his hand just touched Coralie's hair. "Coralie, you imagine that it is the shame of your life here that keeps you away from me. You blush at having been that man's wife, and this makes you feel troubled and anxious, as though you yourself had been guilty. But why should you? It was not your fault. Surely you know that I can guess the misery and hatred that must have passed between you and him, and the constraint that was brought to bear upon you by some machination in order to force your consent to the marriage. No, Coralie, there is something else, and I will tell you what it is. There is something else." He was bending over her still more. He saw her beautiful profile lit up by the blazing logs, and speaking with increasing fervor and adopting the familiar tu and toi, which, in his mouth, retained a note of affectionate respect. He cried, "Am I to speak, little Mother Coralie? I needn't, need I? You have understood, and you read yourself clearly. Ah, I feel you trembling from head to foot. Yes, yes, I tell you, I knew your secret from the very first day. From the very first day you loved your great beggar of a wounded man, all scarred and maimed though he was. Hush, don't deny it. Yes, I understand. You are rather shocked to hear such words as these spoken today. I ought perhaps to have waited. And yet why should I? I am asking you nothing. I know, and that is enough for me. I shan't speak of it again for a long time to come, until the inevitable hour arrives when you are forced to tell it to me yourself. Till then I shall keep silence. But our love will always be between us, and it will be exquisite, little Mother Coralie. It will be exquisite for me to know that you love me. Coralie, there, now you're crying, and you would still deny the truth? Why, when you cry, I know you, little mother, it means that your dear heart is overflowing with tenderness and love. You are crying? Ah, little mother, I never thought you loved me to that extent." Patrice also had tears in his eyes. Coralie's were coursing down her pale cheeks, and he would have given much to kiss that wet face. But the least outward sign of affection appeared to him an offense at such a moment. He was content to gaze at her passionately, and, as he did so, he received an impression that her thoughts were becoming detached from his own, that her eyes were being attracted by an unexpected sight, and that, amid the great silence of their love, she was listening to something that he himself had not heard. And suddenly he too heard that thing, though it was almost imperceptible. It was not so much a sound as the sensation of a presence mingling with the distant rumble of the town. What could be happening? The light had begun to fade, without his noticing it. Also unperceived by Patrice, Madame Essarès had opened the window a little way, for the boudoir was small, and the heat of the fire was becoming oppressive. Nevertheless, the two casements were almost touching. It was at this that she was staring, and it was from there that the danger threatened. Patrice's first impulse was to run to the window, but he restrained himself. The danger was becoming defined. Outside in the twilight, he distinguished through the slanting panes a human form. Next, he saw between the two casements something which gleamed in the light of the fire, and which looked like the barrel of a revolver. Coralie is done for, he thought, if I allow it to be suspected for an instant that I am on my guard. She was in fact opposite the window, with no obstacle intervening. He therefore said aloud, in a careless tone, "Coralie, you must be a little tired. We will say goodbye." At the same time he went round her chair to protect her. But he had not the time to complete his movement. She also no doubt had seen the glint of the revolver, for she drew back abruptly, stammering, "Oh, Patrice! Patrice!" 2 shots rang out, followed by a moan. "You're wounded!" cried Patrice, springing to her side. "No, no," she said, "but the fright! Oh, if he's touched you, the scoundrel!" "No, he hasn't." "Are you quite sure?" He lost 30 or 40 seconds, switching on the electric light, looking at Coralie for signs of a wound, and waiting in an agony of suspense for her to regain full consciousness. Only then did he rush to the window, open it wide, and climb over the balcony. The room was on the first floor. There was plenty of latticework on the wall, but, because of his leg, Patrice had some difficulty in making his way down. Below, on the terrace, he caught his foot in the rungs of an overturned ladder. Next, he knocked against some policemen who were coming from the ground floor. One of them shouted, "I saw the figure of a man making off that way." "Which way?" asked Patrice. The man was running in the direction of the lane. Patrice followed him. But at that moment, from close beside the little door, there came shrill cries and the whimper of a choking voice. "Help! Help!" When Patrice came up, the policeman was already flashing his electric lantern over the ground, and they both saw a human form writhing in the shrubbery. "The door's open!" shouted Patrice. "The assassin has escaped! Go after him!" The policeman vanished down the lane, and Yabon appearing on the scene, Patrice gave him his orders. "Quick as you can, Yabon. If the policeman is going up the lane, you go down. Run! I'll look after the victim." All this time Patrice was stooping low, flinging the light of the policeman's lantern on the man who lay struggling on the ground. He recognized old Simeon, nearly strangled with a red silk cord round his neck. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Can you understand what I'm saying?" He unfastened the cord and repeated his question. Simeon stuttered out a series of incoherent syllables, and then suddenly began to sing and laugh, a very low, jerky laugh, alternating with hiccoughs. He had gone mad. When Monsieur Masseron arrived, Patrice told him what had happened. "Do you really believe it's all over?" he asked. "No." "You were right, and I was wrong," said Monsieur Masseron. "We must take every precaution to ensure Madame Essarès' safety. The house shall be guarded all night." A few minutes later the policeman and Yabon returned, after a vain search. The key that had served to open the door was found in the lane. It was exactly similar to the one in Patrice Belval's possession, equally old and equally rusty. The would-be murderer had thrown it away in the course of his flight. It was 7 o'clock when Patrice, accompanied by Yabon, left the house in the Rue Renoir and turned towards Neuilly. As usual, Patrice took Yabon's arm and, leaning upon him for support as he walked, he said, "I can guess what you're thinking, Yabon." Yabon grunted. "That's it," said Captain Belval in a tone of approval. "We are entirely in agreement, all along the line. What strikes you first and foremost is the utter incapacity displayed by the police. A pack of addlepates, you say. When you speak like that, Master Yabon, you are talking impertinent nonsense, which, coming from you, does not astonish me, and which might easily make me give you the punishment you deserve. But we will overlook it this time. Whatever you may say, the police do what they can, not to mention that, in wartime, they have other things to do than to occupy themselves with the mysterious relations between Captain Belval and Madame Essarès. It is I, therefore, who will have to act, and I have hardly anyone to reckon on but myself. Well, I wonder if I am a match for such adversaries. To think that here's one who has the cheek to come back to the house while it is being watched by the police, to put up a ladder, to listen, no doubt, to my conversation with Monsieur Masseron, and afterwards to what I said to little Mother Coralie, and lastly, to send a couple of bullets whizzing past our ears. What do you say? Am I the man for the job, and could all the French police, overworked as they are, give me the indispensable assistance? No. The man I need for clearing up a thing like this is an exceptional sort of chap, one who unites every quality in himself. In short, the type of man one never sees. Patrice leant more heavily on his companion's arm. You, who know so many good people, haven't you the fellow I want concealed about your person? A genius of sorts? A demigod? Yabon grunted again, merrily this time, and withdrew his arm. He always carried a little electric lamp. Switching on the light, he put the handle between his teeth. Then he took a bit of chalk out of his jacket pocket. A grimy, weather-beaten plaster wall ran along the street. Yabon took his stand in front of the wall and, turning the light upon it, began to write with an unskillful hand, as though each letter cost him a measureless effort, and as though the sum total of those letters were the only one that he had ever succeeded in composing and remembering. In this way he wrote two words which Patrice read out. Arsène Lupin. Arsène Lupin, said Patrice under his breath. And, looking at Yabon in amazement, are you in your right mind? What do you mean by Arsène Lupin? Are you suggesting Arsène Lupin to me? Yabon nodded his head. Arsène Lupin? Do you know him? Yes, Yabon signified. Patrice then remembered that the Senegalese used to spend his days at the hospital, getting his good-natured comrades to read all the adventures of Arsène Lupin aloud to him, and he grinned. Yes, you know him as one knows somebody whose history one has read. No, protested Yabon. Do you know him personally? Yes. Get out, you silly fool. Arsène Lupin is dead. He threw himself into the sea from a rock. And you pretend that you know him? Yes. Do you mean to say that you have met him since he died? Yes. By Jove! And Master Yabon's influence with Arsène Lupin is enough to make him come to life again and put himself out at a sign from Master Yabon. Yes. I say, I had a high opinion of you as it was, but now there is nothing for me but to make you my bow, a friend of the late Arsène Lupin. We're going it! And how long will it take you to place his ghost at our disposal? 6 months? 3 months? 1 month? A fortnight? Yabon made a gesture. About a fortnight, Captain Belval translated. Very well, evoke your friend's spirit. I shall be delighted to make his acquaintance. Only upon my word, you must have a very poor idea of me to imagine that I need a collaborator. What next? Do you take me for a helpless dunderhead? Chapter 9. Patrice and Coralie. Everything happened as Monsieur Masseron had foretold. The press did not speak. The public did not become excited. The various deaths were casually paragraphed. The funeral of Essarès Bey, the wealthy banker, passed unnoticed. But, on the day following the funeral, after Captain Belval, with the support of the police, had made an application to the military authorities, a new order of things was established in the house in the Rue Renoir. It was recognized as home number 2 attached to the hospital in the Champs-Élysées. Madame Essarès was appointed matron, and it became the residence of Captain Belval and his 7 wounded men exclusively. Coralie, therefore, was the only woman remaining. The cook and housemaid were sent away. The 7 cripples did all the work of the house. One acted as hall porter, another as cook, a third as butler. Yabon, promoted to parlour-maid, made it his business to wait on little Mother Coralie. At night he slept in the passage outside her door. By day he mounted guard outside her window. "Let no one near that door or that window," Patrice said to him. "Let no one in. You'll catch it if so much as a mosquito succeeds in entering her room." Nevertheless, Patrice was not easy in his mind. The enemy had given him too many proofs of reckless daring to let him imagine that he could take any steps to ensure her perfect protection. Danger always creeps in where it is least expected, and it was all the more difficult to ward off in that no one knew whence it threatened. Now that Essarès Bey was dead, who was continuing his work? Who had inherited the task of revenge upon Coralie announced in his last letter? Monsieur Mazarin had at once begun his work of investigation, but the dramatic side of the case seemed to leave him indifferent. Since he had not found the body of the man whose dying cries reached Patrice Belval's ears, since he had discovered no clue to the mysterious assailant who had fired at Patrice and Coralie later in the day, since he was not able to trace where the assailant had obtained his ladder, he dropped these questions and confined his efforts entirely to the search of the 1,800 bags of gold. These were all that concerned him. "We have every reason to believe that they are here," he said, "between the four sides of the quadrilateral formed by the garden and the house. Obviously, a bag of gold weighing 100 weight does not take up as much room by a long way as a sack of coal of the same weight. But for all that, 1,800 bags represent a cubic content, and a content like that is not easily concealed. In 2 days he had assured himself that the treasure was hidden neither in the house nor under the house. On the evenings when Essarès Bey's car brought the gold out of the coffers of the Franco-Oriental Bank to the Rue Renoir, Essarès, the chauffeur, and the man known as Grégoire used to pass a thick wire through the grating of which the accomplices spoke. This wire was found. Along the wire ran hooks, which were also found, and on these the bags were slung and afterwards stacked in a large cellar situated exactly under the library. It is needless to say that Monsieur Mazarin and his detectives devoted all their ingenuity and all the painstaking patience of which they were capable to the task of searching every corner of this cellar. Their efforts only established beyond doubt that it contained no secret, save that of a staircase which ran down from the library and which was closed at the top by a trap door concealed by the carpet. In addition to the grating on the Rue Renoir, there was another which overlooked the garden on the level of the first terrace. These two openings were barricaded on the inside by very heavy shutters, so that it was an easy matter to stack thousands and thousands of rouleaux of gold in the cellar before sending them away. But how were they sent away? Monsieur Mazarin wondered. That's the mystery. And why this intermediate stage in the basement in the Rue Renoir? Another mystery. And now we have Faki, Bourneuf, and company declaring that, this time, it was not sent away, that the gold is here, and that it can be found for the searching. We have searched the house. There is still the garden. Let us look there. It was a beautiful old garden, and had once formed part of the wide-stretching estate where people were in the habit, at the end of the 18th century, of going to drink the Passy waters. With a 200-yard frontage, it ran from the Rue Renoir to the quay of the riverside, and led, by 4 successive terraces, to an expanse of lawn as old as the rest of the garden, fringed with thickets of evergreens and shaded by groups of tall trees. But the beauty of the garden lay chiefly in its 4 terraces and in the view which they afforded of the river, the low ground on the left bank and the distant hills. They were united by 20 sets of steps, and 20 paths climbed from the one to the other, paths cut between the buttressing walls, and sometimes hidden in the floods of ivy that dashed from top to bottom. Here and there a statue stood out, a broken column, or the fragments of a capital. The stone balcony that edged the upper terrace was still adorned with all its old terracotta vases. On this terrace also were the ruins of 2 little round temples where, in the old days, the springs bubbled to the surface. In front of the library windows was a circular basin, with, in the center, the figure of a child shooting a slender thread of water through the funnel of a shell. It was the overflow from this basin, forming a little stream, that trickled over the rocks against which Patrice had stumbled on the first evening. 10 acres to explore before we've done, said Monsieur Masseron to himself. He employed upon this work, in addition to Belval's cripples, a dozen of his own detectives. It was not a difficult business, and was bound to lead to some definite result. As M. Masseron never ceased saying, 1,800 bags cannot remain invisible. An excavation leaves traces. You want a hole to go in and out by. But neither the grass of the lawns nor the sand of the paths showed any signs of earth recently disturbed. The ivy, the buttressing walls, the terraces, everything was inspected, but in vain. Here and there, in cutting up the ground, old conduit pipes were found, running towards the Seine, and remains of aqueducts that had once served to carry off the Passy waters. But there was no such thing as a cave, an underground chamber, a brick arch, or anything that looked like a hiding place. Patrice and Coralie watched the progress of the search, and yet, though they fully realized its importance, and though, on the other hand, they were still feeling the strain of the recent dramatic hours, in reality they were engrossed only in the inexplicable problem of their fate, and their conversation nearly always turned upon the mystery of the past. Coralie's mother was the daughter of a French consul at Salonika, where she married a very rich man of a certain age, called Count Odolovich, the head of an ancient Servian family. He died a year after Coralie was born. The widow and child were at that time in France, at this same house in the Rue Renoir, which Count Odolovich had purchased through a young Egyptian called Essarès, his secretary and factotum. Coralie here spent 3 years of her childhood. Then she suddenly lost her mother and was left alone in the world. Essarès took her to Salonika, to a surviving sister of her grandfather the consul, a woman many years younger than her brother. This lady took charge of Coralie. Unfortunately, she fell under Essarès' influence, signed papers, and made her little grandniece sign papers, until the child's whole fortune, administered by the Egyptian, gradually disappeared. At last, when she was about 17, Coralie became the victim of an adventure which left the most hideous memory in her mind, and which had a fatal effect on her life. She was kidnapped one morning by a band of Turks on the plains of Salonika, and spent a fortnight in the palace of the governor of the province, exposed to his desires. Essarès released her, but the release was brought about in so fantastic a fashion that Coralie must have often wondered afterwards whether the Turk and the Egyptian were not in collusion. At any rate, sick in body and depressed in spirits, fearing a fresh assault upon her liberty and yielding to her aunt's wishes, a month later she married this Essarès, who had already been paying her his addresses, and who now definitely assumed in her eyes the figure of a deliverer. It was a hopeless union, the horror of which became manifest to her on the very day on which it was cemented. Coralie was the wife of a man whom she hated, and whose love only grew with the hatred and contempt which she showed for it. Before the end of the year they came and took up their residence at the house in the Rue Renoir. Essarès, who had long ago established, and was at that time managing the Salonika branch of the Franco-Oriental Bank, bought up almost all the shares of the bank itself, acquired the building in the Rue Lafayette for the head office, became one of the financial magnates of Paris, and received the title of Bey in Egypt. This was the story which Coralie told Patrice one day in the beautiful garden at Passy, and in this unhappy past which they explored together and compared with Patrice Belval's own, neither he nor Coralie was able to discover a single point that was common to both. The two of them had lived in different parts of the world. Not one name evoked the same recollection in their minds. There was not a detail that enabled them to understand why each should possess a piece of the same amethyst bead, nor why their joint images should be contained in the same medallion pendant or stuck in the pages of the same album. Failing everything else, said Patrice, we can explain that the pendant found in the hand of Essarès Bey was snatched by him from the unknown friend who was watching over us and whom he murdered. But what about the album, which he wore in a pocket sewn inside his vest? Neither attempted to answer the question. Then Patrice asked, "Tell me about Simeon." "Simeon has always lived here." Even in your mother's time? No, it was 1 or 2 years after my mother's death, and after I went to Salonika, that Essarès put him to look after this property and keep it in good condition. Was he Essarès' secretary? I never knew what his exact functions were. But he was not Essarès' secretary, nor his confidant either. They never talked together intimately. He came to see us 2 or 3 times at Salonika. I remember one of his visits. I was quite a child, and I heard him speaking to Essarès in a very angry tone, apparently threatening him. With what? I don't know. I know nothing at all about Simeon. He kept himself very much to himself and was nearly always in the garden, smoking his pipe, dreaming, tending the trees and flowers, sometimes with the assistance of 2 or 3 gardeners whom he would send for. How did he behave to you? Here again I can't give any definite impression. We never talked, and his occupations very seldom brought him into contact with me. Nevertheless, I sometimes thought that his eyes used to seek me, through their yellow spectacles, with a certain persistency and perhaps even a certain interest. Moreover, lately, he liked going with me to the hospital, and he would then, either there or on the way, show himself more attentive, more eager to please, so much so that I have been wondering this last day or 2. She hesitated for a moment, undecided whether to speak, and then continued. Yes, it's a very vague notion, but all the same. Look here, there's one thing I forgot to tell you. Do you know why I joined the hospital in the Champs-Élysées, the hospital where you were lying wounded and ill? It was because Simeon took me there. He knew that I wanted to become a nurse, and he suggested this hospital. And then, if you think, later on, the photograph in the pendant, the one showing you in uniform and me as a nurse, can only have been taken at the hospital. Well, of the people here, in this house, no one except Simeon ever went there. You will also remember that he used to come to Salonika, where he saw me as a child and afterwards as a girl, and that there also he may have taken the snapshots in the album. So that, if we allow that he had some correspondent who on his side followed your footsteps in life, it would not be impossible to believe that the unknown friend, whom you assume to have intervened between us, the one who sent you the key of the garden, was old Simeon. Patrice interrupted. The theory won't hold water. Why not? Because this friend is dead. The man who, as you say, sought to intervene between us, who sent me the key of the garden, who called me to the telephone to tell me the truth, that man was murdered. There is not the least doubt about it. I heard the cries of a man who was being killed, dying cries, the cries which a man utters when at the moment of death. You can never be sure. I am, absolutely. There is no shadow of doubt in my mind. The man whom I call our unknown friend died before finishing his work. He died murdered, whereas Simeon is alive. Besides, continued Patrice, this man had a different voice from Simeon, a voice which I had never heard before and which I shall never hear again. Coralie was convinced and did not insist. They were seated on one of the benches in the garden, enjoying the bright April sunshine. The buds of the chestnut trees shone at the tips of the branches. The heavy scent of the wallflowers rose from the borders, and their brown and yellow blossoms, like a cluster of bees and wasps pressed close together, swayed to the light breeze. Suddenly, Patrice felt a thrill. Coralie had placed her hand on his with engaging friendliness, and when he turned to look at her, he saw that she was in tears. "What's the matter, little Mother Coralie?" Coralie's head bent down and her cheek touched the officer's shoulder. He dared not move. She was treating him as a protecting elder brother, and he shrank from showing any warmth of affection that might annoy her. "What is it, dear?" he repeated. "What's the matter?" "Oh, it is so strange," she murmured. "Look, Patrice, look at those flowers. They were on the 3rd terrace, commanding a view of the 4th. And this, the lowest of the terraces, was adorned not with borders of wallflowers, but with beds, in which were mingled all manner of spring flowers, tulips, silvery alyssums, hyacinths, with a great round plot of pansies in the middle. "Look over there," she said, pointing to this plot with her outstretched arm. "Do you see? Letters, Patrice looked and gradually perceived that the clumps of pansies were so arranged as to form on the ground some letters that stood out among the other flowers. It did not appear at the first glance. It took a certain time to see. But once seen, the letters grouped themselves of their own accord, forming 3 words set down in a single line: Patrice and Coralie. "Ah," he said in a low voice, "I understand what you mean." It gave them a thrill of inexpressible excitement to read their 2 names, which a friendly hand had, so to speak, sewn. Their 2 names united in pansy flowers. It was inexpressibly exciting, too, that he and she should always find themselves thus linked together by events, linked together by their portraits, linked together by an unseen force of will, linked together now by the struggling effort of little flowers that spring up, waken into life, and blossom in predetermined order. Coralie, sitting up, said, "It's Simeon who attends to the garden." "Yes," he said, wavering slightly, "but surely that does not affect my opinion. Our unknown friend is dead, but Simeon may have known him. Simeon perhaps was acting with him in certain matters and must know a good deal. Oh, if he could only put us on the right road!" An hour later, as the sun was sinking on the horizon, they climbed the terraces. On reaching the top, they saw Monsieur Mazarin beckoning to them. "I have something curious to show you," he said. "Something I have found which will interest both you, madame, and you, captain, particularly." He led them to the very end of the terrace, outside the occupied part of the house next to the library. 2 detectives were standing mattock in hand. In the course of their searching, Monsieur Mazarin explained, they had begun by removing the ivy from the low wall adorned with terracotta vases. Thereupon Monsieur Mazarin's attention was attracted by the fact that this wall was covered, for a length of some yards, by a layer of plaster which appeared to be more recent in date than the stone. "What did it mean?" said Monsieur Mazarin. "I had to presuppose some motive. I therefore had this layer of plaster demolished, and underneath it I found a second layer, not so thick as the first, and mingled with the rough stone. Come closer, or rather, no, stand back a little way. You can see better like that." The second layer really served only to keep in place some small white pebbles, which constituted a sort of mosaic set in black pebbles, and formed a series of large written letters spelling 3 words. And these 3 words once again were Patrice and Coralie. "What do you say to that?" asked Monsieur Mazarin. "Observe that the inscription goes several years back, at least 10 years, when we consider the condition of the ivy clinging to this part of the wall." "At least 10 years," Patrice repeated, when he was once more alone with Coralie. 10 years ago was when you were not married, when you were still at Salonica, and when nobody used to come to this garden, nobody except Simeon and such people as he chose to admit. And among these, quote, he concluded, was our unknown friend who is now dead. And Simeon knows the truth, Coralie. They saw old Simeon late that afternoon, as they had seen him constantly since the tragedy, wandering in the garden or along the passages of the house, restless and distraught, with his comforter always wound round his head and his spectacles on his nose, stammering words which no one could understand. At night, his neighbor, one of the maimed soldiers, would often hear him humming to himself. Patrice twice tried to make him speak. He shook his head and did not answer, or else laughed like an idiot. The problem was becoming complicated, and nothing pointed to a possible solution. Who was it that, since their childhood, had promised them to each other as a pair betrothed long beforehand by an inflexible ordinance? Who was it that arranged the pansy bed last autumn, when they did not know each other? And who was it that had written their two names 10 years ago in white pebbles within the thickness of a wall? These were haunting questions for two young people in whom love had awakened quite spontaneously, and who suddenly saw stretching behind them a long past, common to them both. Each step that they took in the garden seemed to them a pilgrimage amid forgotten memories, and at every turn in a path they were prepared to discover some new proof of the bond that linked them together unknown to themselves. As a matter of fact, during those few days they saw their initials interlaced twice on the trunk of a tree, once on the back of a bench, and twice again their names appeared inscribed on old walls and concealed behind a layer of plaster overhung with ivy. On these two occasions, their names were accompanied by two separate dates: Patrice and Coralie, 1904, Patrice and Coralie, 1907. 11 years ago and 8 years ago, said the officer, and always our two names, Patrice and Coralie. Their hands met and clasped each other. The great mystery of their past brought them as closely together as did the great love which filled them, and of which they refrained from speaking. In spite of themselves, however, they sought out solitude, and it was in this way that, a fortnight after the murder of Essarès Bay, as they passed the little door opening on the lane, they decided to go out by it and to stroll down to the river bank. No one saw them, for both the approach to the door and the path leading to it were hidden by a screen of tall bushes, and Monsieur Masseron and his men were exploring the old greenhouses which stood at the other side of the garden, and the old furnace and chimney which had been used for signaling. But, when he was outside, Patrice stopped. Almost in front of him, in the opposite wall, was an exactly similar door. He called Coralie's attention to it, but she said, "There is nothing astonishing about that. This wall is the boundary of another garden which at one time belonged to the one we have just left. But who lives there? Nobody. The little house which overlooks it, and which comes before mine, in the Rue Rainoir, is always shut up." "Same door, same key, perhaps," Patrice murmured, half to himself. He inserted in the lock the rusty key which had reached him by messenger. The lock responded. "Well," he said, "the series of miracles is continuing. Will this one be in our favor?" The vegetation had been allowed to run riot in the narrow strip of ground that faced them. However, in the middle of the exuberant grass, a well-trodden path, which looked as if it were often used, started from the door in the wall and rose obliquely to the single terrace, on which stood a dilapidated lodge with closed shutters. It was built on one floor, but was surmounted by a small lantern-shaped belvedere. It had its own entrance in the Rue Rainoir, from which it was separated by a yard and a very high wall. This entrance seemed to be barricaded, with boards and posts nailed together. They walked round the house and were surprised by the sight that awaited them on the right-hand side. The foliage had been trained into rectangular cloisters, carefully kept, with regular arcades cut in yew and box hedges. A miniature garden was laid out in this space, the very home of silence and tranquility. Here also were wallflowers and pansies and hyacinths. And 4 paths, coming from 4 corners of the cloisters, met round a central space, where stood the 5 columns of a small, open temple, rudely constructed of pebbles and unmortared building stones. Under the dome of this little temple was a tombstone, and, in front of it, an old wooden praying chair, from the bars of which hung, on the left, an ivory crucifix, and, on the right, a rosary composed of amethyst beads in a gold filigree setting. "Coralie, Coralie," whispered Patrice, in a voice trembling with emotion, "who can be buried here?" They went nearer. There were bead wreaths laid in rows on the tombstone. They counted 19, each bearing the date of one of the last 19 years. Pushing them aside, they read the following inscription in gilt letters worn and soiled by the rain. Here lie Patrice and Coralie, both of whom were murdered. On the 14th of April 1895. Revenge to me. I will repay. Chapter 10. The Red Cord. Coralie, feeling her legs give way beneath her, had flung herself on the prie-dieu, and there knelt, praying fervently and wildly. She could not tell on whose behalf, for the repose of what unknown soul her prayers were offered, but her whole being was afire with fever and exaltation, and the very action of praying seemed able to assuage her. "What was your mother's name, Coralie?" Patrice whispered. "Louise," she replied, "and my father's name was Armand." "It cannot be either of them, therefore, and yet—" Patrice also was displaying the greatest agitation. Stooping down, he examined the 19 wreaths, renewed his inspection of the tombstone, and said, "All the same, Coralie, the coincidence is really too extraordinary. My father died in 1895. "And my mother died in that year too," she said, "though I do not know the exact date." "We shall find out, Coralie," he declared. "These things can all be verified." But meanwhile one truth becomes clear. The man who used to interlace the names of Patrice and Coralie was not thinking only of us, and was not considering only the future. Perhaps he thought even more of the past, of that Coralie and Patrice, whom he knew to have suffered a violent death, and whom he had undertaken to avenge. "Come away, Coralie. No one must suspect that we have been here." They went down the path, and through the 2 doors on the lane. They were not seen coming in. Patrice at once brought Coralie indoors, urged Yabon and his comrades to increase their vigilance, and left the house. He came back in the evening only to go out again early the next day, and it was not until the day after, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, that he asked to be shown up to Coralie. "Have you found out?" she asked him at once. "I have found out a great many things which do not dispel the darkness of the present. I am almost tempted to say that they increase it. They do, however, throw a very vivid light on the past." "Do they explain what we saw 2 days ago?" she asked anxiously. "Listen to me, Coralie." He sat down opposite her and said, "I shall not tell you all the steps that I have taken. I will merely sum up the result of those which led to some result. I went first of all to the mayor of Passy's office, and from there to the Servian legation." "Then you persist in assuming that it was my mother?" "Yes. I took a copy of her death certificate, Coralie. Your mother died on the 14th of April, 1895. "Oh," she said, "that is the date on the tomb, the very date." "But the name? Coralie? My father used to call her Louise." "Your mother's name was Louise Coralie Countess Odolovitch." "Oh, my mother," she murmured. "My poor darling mother. Then it was she who was murdered." "It was for her that I was praying over the way?" "For her, Coralie, and for my father. I discovered his full name at the mayor's office in the Rue Drouot. My father was Armand Patrice Belval. He died on the 14th of April, 1895. Patrice was right in saying that a singular light had been thrown upon the past. He had now positively established that the inscription on the tombstone related to his father and Coralie's mother, both of whom were murdered on the same day. But by whom, and for what reason? In consequence of what tragedies? This was what Coralie asked him to tell her. "I cannot answer your questions yet," he replied. "But I addressed another to myself, one more easily solved, and that I did solve. This also makes us certain of an essential point. I wanted to know to whom the lodge belonged. The outside, in the Rue Rainoir, affords no clue. You have seen the wall and the door of the yard. They show nothing in particular, but the number of the property was sufficient for my purpose. I went to the local receiver and learnt that the taxes were paid by a notary in the Avenue de l'Opéra. I called on this notary, who told me—" He stopped for a moment and then said, "The lodge was bought 21 years ago by my father. 2 years later my father died, and the lodge, which of course formed part of his estate, was put up for sale by the present notary's predecessor, and bought by one Simeon Diadochus, a Greek subject." "It's he!" cried Coralie. "Simeon's name is Diadochus." "Well, Simeon Diadochus," Patrice continued, "was a friend of my father's, because my father appointed him the sole executor of his will, and because it was Simeon Diadochus who, through the notary in question and a London solicitor, paid my school fees, and, when I attained my majority, made over to me the sum of 200,000 francs, the balance of my inheritance." They maintained a long silence. Many things were becoming manifest, but indistinctly, as yet, and shaded, like things seen in the evening mist, and one thing stood in sharper outline than the rest, for Patrice murmured, "Your mother and my father loved each other, Coralie." The thought united them more closely and affected them profoundly. Their love was the counterpart of another love, bruised by trials, like theirs, but still more tragic and ending in bloodshed and death. "Your mother and my father loved each other," he repeated. "I should say they must have belonged to that class of rather enthusiastic lovers whose passion indulges in charming little childish ways, for they had a trick of calling each other when alone by names which nobody else used to them, and they selected their second Christian names, which were also yours and mine. One day your mother dropped her amethyst rosary. The largest of the beads broke in 2 pieces. My father had one of the pieces mounted as a trinket which he hung on his watch chain. Both were widowed. You were 2 years old and I was 8. In order to devote himself altogether to the woman he loved, my father sent me to England and bought the lodge in which your mother, who lived in the big house next door, used to go and see him, crossing the lane and using the same key for both doors. It was no doubt in this lodge, or in the garden round it, that they were murdered. We shall find that out, because there must be visible proofs of the murder, proofs which Simeon Diadochus discovered, since he was not afraid to say so in the inscription on the tombstone." "And who was the murderer?" Coralie asked under her breath. "You suspect it, Coralie, as I do. The hated name comes to your mind, even though we have no grounds for speaking with certainty." "Essarès!" she cried in anguish. "Most probably." She hid her face in her hands. No, it is impossible. It is impossible that I should have been the wife of the man who killed my mother." "You bore his name, but you were never his wife. You told him so the evening before his death, in my presence." "Let us say nothing that we are unable to say positively, but all the same let us remember that he was your evil genius. Remember also that Simeon, my father's friend and executor, the man who bought the lovers' lodge, the man who swore upon their tomb to avenge them. Remember that Simeon, a few months after your mother's death, persuaded Essarès to engage him as caretaker of the estate, became his secretary, and gradually made his way into Essarès' life. His only object must have been to carry out a plan of revenge. There has been no revenge. What do we know about it? Do we know how Essarès met his death? Certainly it was not Simeon who killed him, as Simeon was at the hospital. But he may have caused him to be killed. And revenge has 1,000 ways of manifesting itself. Lastly, Simeon was most likely obeying instructions that came from my father. There is little doubt that he wanted first to achieve an aim which my father and your mother had at heart, the union of our destinies, Coralie. And it was this aim that ruled his life. It was he evidently who placed among the knickknacks which I collected as a child this amethyst, of which the other half formed a bead in your rosary. It was he who collected our photographs. He lastly was our unknown friend and protector, the one who sent me the key, accompanied by a letter which I never received, unfortunately. Then, Patrice, you no longer believe that he is dead, this unknown friend, or that you heard his dying cries. I cannot say. Simeon was not necessarily acting alone. He may have had a confidant, an assistant in the work which he undertook. Perhaps it was this other man who died at 19 minutes past 7. I cannot say. Everything that happened on that ill-fated morning remains involved in the deepest mystery. The only conviction that we are able to hold is that for 20 years Simeon Diadochus has worked unobtrusively and patiently on our behalf, doing his utmost to defeat the murderer, and that Simeon Diadochus is alive. Alive, but mad, Patrice added, so that we can neither thank him nor question him about the grim story which he knows or about the dangers that threaten you. Patrice resolved once more to make the attempt, though he felt sure of a fresh disappointment. Simeon had a bedroom, next to that occupied by 2 of the wounded soldiers. in the wing which formerly contained the servants' quarters. Here Patrice found him. He was sitting half asleep in a chair turned towards the garden. His pipe was in his mouth. He had allowed it to go out. The room was small, sparsely furnished, but clean and light. Hidden from view, the best part of the old man's life was spent here. Monsieur Masseron had often visited the room in Simeon's absence, and so had Patrice, each from his own point of view. The only discovery worthy of note consisted of a crude diagram in pencil on the white wallpaper behind a chest of drawers, 3 lines intersecting to form a large equilateral triangle. In the middle of this geometrical figure were 3 words clumsily inscribed in adhesive gold leaf, the Golden Triangle. There was nothing more, not another clue of any kind, to further Monsieur Masseron's search. Patrice walked straight up to the old man and tapped him on the shoulder. "Simeon!" he said. The other lifted his yellow spectacles to him, and Patrice felt a sudden wish to snatch away this glass obstacle, which concealed the old fellow's eyes, and prevented him from looking into his soul and his distant memories. Simeon began to laugh foolishly. "So this," thought Patrice, "is my friend, and my father's friend. He loved my father, respected his wishes, was faithful to his memory, raised a tomb to him, prayed on it, and swore to avenge him. And now his mind has gone." Patrice felt that speech was useless. But, though the sound of his voice roused no echo in that wandering brain, it was possible that the eyes were susceptible to a reminder. He wrote on a clean sheet of paper the words that Simeon had gazed upon so often. Patrice and Coralie, the 14th of April, 1895. The old man looked, shook his head, and repeated his melancholy, foolish chuckle. The officer added a new line, Armand Belleville. The old man displayed the same torpor. Patrice continued the test. He wrote down the names of Essarès Bey and Colonel Faki. He drew a triangle. The old man failed to understand and went on chuckling. But suddenly his laughter lost some of its childishness. Patrice had written the name of Bourneuf, the accomplice, and this time the old secretary appeared to be stirred by a recollection. He tried to get up, fell back in his chair, then rose to his feet again and took his hat from a peg on the wall. He left his room, and followed by Patrice, marched out of the house and turned to the left, in the direction of Auteuil. He moved like a man in a trance who is hypnotized into walking without knowing where he is going. He led the way along the Rue de Boulainvilliers, crossed the Seine, and turned down the Quai de Grenelle with an unhesitating step. Then, when he reached the boulevard, he stopped, putting out his arm, made a sign to Patrice to do likewise. A kiosk hid them from view. He put his head round it. Patrice followed his example. Opposite, at the corner of the boulevard and a side street, was a café, with a portion of the pavement in front of it, marked out by dwarf shrubs in tubs. Behind these tubs, 4 men sat drinking. 3 of them had their backs turned to Patrice. He saw the only one that faced him, and he at once recognized Bourneuf. By this time Simeon was some distance away. Like a man whose part is played, and who leaves it to others to complete the work, Patrice looked round, caught sight of a post office, and went in briskly. He knew that Monsieur Masseron was at the Rue Raynouard. He telephoned and told him where Bourneuf was. Monsieur Masseron replied that he would come at once. Since the murder of Essarès Bey, Monsieur Masseron's enquiry had made no progress, insofar as Colonel Faki's 4 accomplices were concerned. True, they discovered the man Grégoire's sanctuary and the bedrooms with the wall cupboards, but the whole place was empty. The accomplices had disappeared. Old Simeon, said Patrice to himself, was acquainted with their habits. He must have known that they were accustomed to meet at this café on a certain day of the week, at a fixed hour, and he suddenly remembered it all at the sight of Bourneuf's name. A few minutes later, Monsieur Masseron alighted from his car with his men. The business did not take long. The open front of the café was surrounded. The accomplices offered no resistance. Monsieur Masseron sent 3 of them under a strong guard to the dépôt and hustled Bourneuf into a private room. "Come along," he said to Patrice. "We'll question him." "Madame Essarès is alone at the house," Patrice objected. "Alone? No, there are all your soldier-men." "Yes, but I would rather go back, if you don't mind. It's the first time that I've left her, and I'm justified in feeling anxious." "It's only a matter of a few minutes," Monsieur Masseron insisted. "One should always take advantage of the fluster caused by the arrest." Patrice followed him, but they soon saw that Bourneuf was not one of those men who are easily put out. He simply shrugged his shoulders at their threats. "It is no use, sir," he said, "to try and frighten me." "I risk nothing. Shot, do you say? Nonsense! You don't shoot people in France for the least thing, and we are all four subjects of a neutral country. Tried, sentenced, imprisoned? Never! You forget that you have kept everything dark so far, and when you hushed up the murder of Mustapha, of Faki, and of Essarès, it was not done with the object of reviving the case for no valid reason. No, sir, I am quite easy. The internment camp is the worst that can await me." "Then you refuse to answer?" said Monsieur Masseron. "Not a bit of it. I accept internment, but there are 20 different ways of treating a man in these camps, and I should like to earn your favor, and in so doing, make sure of reasonable comfort till the end of the war. But first of all, what do you know?" "Pretty well everything. That's a pity. It decreases my value." "Do you know about Essarès last night?" "Yes, with the bargain of the 4 millions. What's become of the money?" Bourneuf made a furious gesture. "Taken from us! Stolen! It was a trap." "Who took it?" "One Grégoire." "Who was he?" "His familiar, as we have since learnt. We discovered that this Grégoire was no other than a fellow who used to serve as his chauffeur on occasion, and who therefore helped him to convey the bags of gold from the bank to his house." "Yes, and we also think we know. Look here, you may as well call it a certainty. Grégoire is a woman." "A woman?" "Exactly. His mistress. We have several proofs of it, but she's a trustworthy, capable woman, strong as a man and afraid of nothing." "Do you know her address?" "No." "As to the gold, have you no clue to its whereabouts, no suspicion?" "No. The gold is in the garden, or in the house in the Rue Raynouard. We saw it being taken in every day for a week. It has not been taken out since. We kept watch every night. The bags are there." "No clue either to Essarès' murderer?" "No, none." "Are you quite sure? Why should I tell a lie? Suppose it was yourself, or one of your friends. We thought that you would suspect us. Fortunately, we happen to have an alibi. Easy to prove? Impossible to upset. We'll look into it. So you have nothing more to reveal?" "No. But I have an idea, or rather a question which you will answer or not, as you please. Who betrayed us? Your reply may throw some useful light, for one person only knew of our weekly meetings here from 4 to 5 o'clock. One person only, Essarès Bey, and he himself often came here to confer with us." "Essarès is dead. Then who gave us away?" "Old Simeon." Bourneuf started with astonishment. "What? Simeon? Simeon Diadochus?" "Yes. Simeon Diadochus, Essarès Bey's secretary." "He? Oh, I'll make him pay for this, the blackguard." "But no, it's impossible." "What makes you say that it's impossible?" "Why, because—" He stopped and thought for some time, no doubt to convince himself that there was no harm in speaking. Then he finished his sentence. "Because old Simeon was on our side." "What's that you say?" exclaimed Patrice, whose turn it was to be surprised. "I say, and I swear, that Simeon Diadochus was on our side. He was our man. It was he who kept us informed of Essarès Bey's shady tricks. It was he who rang us up at 9 o'clock in the evening to tell us that Essarès had lit the furnace of the old hothouses, and that the signal of the sparks was going to work. It was he who opened the door to us, pretending to resist, of course, and allowed us to tie him up in the porter's lodge. It was he, lastly, who paid and dismissed the men-servants. But why? Why this treachery? For the sake of money? No, from hatred. He bore Essarès Bey a hatred that often gave us the shudders. What prompted it? I don't know. Simeon keeps his own counsel. But it dated a long way back. Did he know where the gold was hidden? Asked M. Masseron. No. And it was not for want of hunting to find out. He never knew how the bags got out the cellar, which was only a temporary hiding place. And yet, they used to leave the grounds. If so, how are we to know that the same thing didn't happen this time? This time we were keeping watch the whole way round outside, a thing which Simeon could not do by himself. Patrice now put the question, "Can you tell us nothing more about him?" "No, I can't." Wait, though. There was one rather curious thing. On the afternoon of the great day, I received a letter in which Simeon gave me certain particulars. In the same envelope was another letter, which had evidently got there by some incredible mistake, for it appeared to be highly important. "What did it say?" asked Patrice anxiously. "It was all about a key." "Don't you remember the details?" "Here is the letter. I kept it in order to give it back to him and warn him what he had done. Here, it's certainly his writing." Patrice took the sheet of notepaper, and the first thing that he saw was his own name. The letter was addressed to him, as he anticipated. "Patrice, you will this evening receive a key. The key opens 2 doors midway down a lane leading to the river. One, on the right, is that of the garden of the woman you love. The other, on the left, that of a garden where I want you to meet me at 9 o'clock in the morning on the 14th of April. She will be there also. You shall learn who I am and the object which I intend to attain. You shall both hear things about the past that will bring you still closer together. From now until the 14th, the struggle which begins tonight will be a terrible one. If anything happens to me, it is certain that the woman you love will run the greatest dangers. Watch over her, Patrice. Do not leave her for an instant unprotected. But I do not intend to let anything happen to me, and you shall both know the happiness which I have been preparing for you so long. My best love to you." "It's not signed," said Bourneuf, "but, I repeat, it's in Simeon's handwriting. As for the lady, she is obviously Madame Essarès." "But what danger can she be running?" exclaimed Patrice uneasily. "Essarès is dead, so there is nothing to fear." "I wouldn't say that. He would take some killing." "Whom can he have instructed to avenge him? Who would continue his work?" "I can't say, but I should take no risks." Patrice waited to hear no more. He thrust the letter into Monsieur Masseron's hand and made his escape. "Rue Renoir, fast as you can," he said, springing into a taxi. He was eager to reach his destination. The dangers of which old Simeon spoke seemed suddenly to hang over Coralie's head. Already the enemy, taking advantage of Patrice's absence, might be attacking his beloved. And who could defend her? "If anything happens to me," Simeon had said. And the supposition was partly realized, since he had lost his wits. "Come, come," muttered Patrice, "this is sheer idiocy. I am fancying things. There is no reason." But his mental anguish increased every minute. He reminded himself that old Simeon was still in full possession of his faculties at the time when he wrote that letter, and gave the advice which it contained. He reminded himself that old Simeon had purposely informed him that the key opened the door of Coralie's garden, so that he, Patrice, might keep an effective watch by coming to her in case of need. He saw Simeon some way ahead of him. It was growing late, and the old fellow was going home. Patrice passed him just outside the porter's lodge and heard him humming to himself. "Any news?" Patrice asked the soldier on duty. "No, sir." "Where's little Mother Coralie?" "She had a walk in the garden and went upstairs half an hour ago." "Yabon?" "Yabon went up with little Mother Coralie. He should be at her door." Patrice climbed the stairs, feeling a good deal calmer. But when he came to the first floor, He was astonished to find that the electric light was not on. He turned on the switch. Then he saw, at the end of the passage, Yabon on his knees outside Coralie's room, with his head leaning against the wall. The door was open. "What are you doing there?" he shouted, running up. Yabon made no reply. Patrice saw that there was blood on the shoulder of his jacket. At that moment the Senegalese sank to the floor. "Damn it! He's wounded! Dead, perhaps!" He leapt over the body and rushed into the room, switching on the light at once. Coralie was lying at full length on a sofa. Round her neck was the terrible little red silk cord. And yet Patrice did not experience that awful, numbing despair which we feel in the presence of irretrievable misfortunes. It seemed to him that Coralie's face had not the pallor of death. He found that she was in fact breathing. "She's not dead, she's not dead," said Patrice to himself. "And she's not going to die, I'm sure of it, nor Yabon either. They've failed this time." He loosened the cords. In a few seconds, Coralie heaved a deep breath and recovered consciousness. A smile lit up her eyes at the sight of him, but suddenly remembering, she threw her arms, still so weak, around him. "Oh, Patrice," she said in a trembling voice, "I'm frightened for you." "What are you frightened of, Coralie? Who is the scoundrel?" "I didn't see him." He put out the light, caught me by the throat, and whispered, "You first. Tonight it will be your lover's turn." "Oh, Patrice, I'm frightened for you."